some of our regulars that we've got on the line here. Very good to see you. And also from two people who are further afield. So we've got people from Sydney. We've got someone from Tokyo. Very good to see you here. And then people as far afield as Sheffield in the UK. So this is about engagement, and you may have guessed that the title's a bit tongue-in-cheek. So can neuroscience improve your engagement scores? And I'll tell you straight up, I don't think it can, but hopefully what we're going to cover today will give you some ideas about things you can practically do that might improve your engagement scores. And at the end, we're going to talk about some things that impact scores. So for those of you who don't know us, we're called Head, Heart and Brain, and we know that's a kind of quirky name. We work in leadership development, and we back everything we do up with science, so looking at mainly neuroscience, but also other psychological sciences. And we've increasingly, over the last 18 months, been doing work with HR functions on looking at their policies and practices and how understanding the brain, or being brain savvy as we call it, can help improve the way they operate in the organizations. You can see more on our website. I won't say any more now. So let's start off with a poll. Liz, can you pull this first poll up? So how do you define engagement in your organization? And I've given 4 potential definitions here, short definitions obviously. So is it about purpose and discretionary effort, people having clear goals and a sense of satisfaction in their work, a positive mood and pleasure with purpose and discretionary effort, or high levels of effort which the employee is happy to make? Which of those is the closest to your definition of engagement? This is interesting. Lots about positive mood.
Do you want me to broadcast the results to everybody as well? You have to wait till everyone's completed.
Yeah.
I'll wait till everyone's completed.
So pretty clearly coming out here, positive mood, that is pleasure in the work, purpose and discretionary effort is the definition that's the closest for most people, nearly 70% of you saying that. So Liz, if that poll can kind of come back a few slides in, I'd be grateful, because we can, that's brilliant, it's over there now. Okay. So the reason for asking you that is one of the challenges with engagement is that there's often a lot of overlap with other states. So with either definitions of job satisfaction, flow, motivation, or happiness. And we're increasingly seeing, I think, organizations focus on happiness rather than engagement. So there are lots of definitions, and the most recent report from the conference board suggests that organizations should create their own definition. The trouble with that is, of course, you then can't benchmark your engagement scores with those of other organizations, which is what a number of the survey companies are offering you. So, a bit of a dilemma. Do you go with the survey company's definition, or do you create your own? And what does that really mean in terms of what you see in the behavior of people in your organization? So if we look back to our poll,
Not back here.
can I pull it up? Sorry, Liz, I don't know how to make that bigger.
It's all right, I'm here.
Thank you. If you look back to our poll, the first definition that I gave was a definition of job satisfaction. The next one about clear goals was really a definition about flow. The positive mood was about happiness rather than engagement. So that's a typical definition of happiness. And the final one was about motivation. So arguably, what most people are measuring is actually how happy people are at work rather than how engaged they are. Now, that may not matter, but I think it's worth reflecting on what is it that we're really focused on at work, and also whether the things we're doing are going to increase or decrease that focus. So so the definition I thought we'd use for this session was that engagement involves the interplay between three factors: a sense of purpose in your job and what you're doing, an emotional attachment to it, so having trust and commitment to the organisation, and lastly, having some skin in the game, if you like, so discretionary effort, but with an involvement in getting the right results, the right outcomes. And all the research would tell us that those things, the things that drive that, are pride in the company, and particularly the relationship with your manager, so the day-to-day person that you have the most results with. Now, none of that is really anything to do with your brain, but there are lots of things to do with your brain that impact those things. So I thought we'd look at 4 areas and what neuroscience is telling us about those, and how the way our brain is wired impacts our experience of them. So the first, actually, I'm going to change this. So let's talk about in-group, out-group, first of all. Our brain, because we take in so much data, we have to categorize that data in order to be able to deal with it. So within something like 200 milliseconds, unconsciously, we categorize people into their gender and into whether they are similar to us or different from us. And what we're basically doing, it's our amygdala saying, is this person a danger to me? Are they a foe or a potential foe? Or are they a friend and I can trust them? So the implications of this for engagement is, once we've categorized people, we then have a whole host of other subcategories and links that determine how we think about someone. So if we think about them as friends, we're much more able to understand their perspective. We're much more empathetic to them, especially in times of difficulty, and we tend to cluster with people we think of as our in-group, particularly in times of threat. So from an engagement point of view, what this effectively does is, if we clearly identify who our in-group is, we're likely to be more bonded with those people. And where we've got common goals, we'll be motivated to actually achieve those goals with the other people in the group. The opposite is also true. So if we think of someone as our out-group, as them, as is often termed in business, we're not as empathetic to them. We're less rewarded by achieving goals with them. And we may even delight in their downfall, so in any troubles that they may have. So I guess one of the questions to ask here is, how clear is it to people in your organization who they're connected with, who their in-group is, and how do you make sure that's the right group? So is it just a tiny slice of the business unit, or is it the whole business unit? And as I said, one of the key things to increasing people's sense of in-group is to have a clear sense of purpose. So let's look at purpose and how purpose actually happens in the brain. So purpose, Matt Lieberman, who's, I guess, our favorite neuroscientist, he's at UCLA in California, did some research a few years ago looking at the ways in which we understand why someone is doing something. So we basically have 2 systems of understanding people within the brain. One is our mirror neuron system, and the other is what's often called our default system, or our medial prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that understands ourselves and others. And he wanted to understand why we have two systems and what's the different things that they're doing. And what his research showed was that mirror neurons actually understand how someone does it and what they're doing, and our medial prefrontal cortex, or default system, understands why they're doing it. So it's really important to have that part of the brain activated if we want people to have a clear sense of purpose in their role. And one of the troubles is that part of the brain tends to come on like a reflex whenever we're not doing cognitive or rational thinking or task thinking. And if you think about most of our jobs these days, we're often in busy mode. And we tend to either get out of the habit of noticing the signals that that part of the brain is sending to us. So of noticing signals about, that person looked a bit uncomfortable, or I wonder why they were frowning at what I've just said, or, their eyes were glazing over. Did they really understand what I was trying to say? So we tend to kind of not give ourselves the time to notice those signals that are coming through. And there's some very interesting research that's just come out from Matt Lieberman that in actual fact, to really understand those signals, we need to give ourselves some downtime. We talked more about that in a webinar that we ran earlier in the year on work habits, which is on our website. There's a recording of it if you're interested in understanding more about the importance of downtime. So to help people have a clear purpose, you also need to help them have some space to think and to actually be able to activate this part of the brain, or at least, even though it may be activated, to notice what the rather subtle signals it is that they send. Yeah, so we'll send you that link to the previous webinar if people are interested. The other thing about purpose is that we know the brain gets a sense of reward when people have some autonomy or have options about the way they do their job. So another aspect of helping people to be more engaged is not only are they clear about what they're there to do, but also do they have some discretion about how they go about doing it. So we've got Zoe here asking, if people don't activate the prefrontal part of the brain regularly, does it reduce the ability to recognize the why people are doing things? Yeah, it's actually the medial prefrontal cortex, so it's the mid part of the prefrontal cortex, or the default system. And it's not that that part of the brain doesn't come on. We know it gets activated whenever we're not thinking about cognitive things. But it's what I'm saying is we get out of the habit of noticing the signals that that's sending to us, because they tend to be quite subtle. They're the signals that we would probably describe as intuition, or a nudge or a hint. And I think what this research is implying, or it's not completely shown this, but what this research is implying is that when we get out of the habit of noticing those signals, we're losing that information about why people are doing things or why it might be important for someone else. So we've talked about in-group, out-group, and we've talked about the importance of having a clear purpose. The third thing that I think is important to a sense of engagement when we think about our definition is mood. So how positively are people experiencing their work environment? And most of the research in neuroscience has looked at the sense of threat And we know that the sense of threat is probably 3 to 5 times more active than our sense of reward. So we notice the negative things in our world more frequently than we notice the positive things. And from a survival point of view, that made sense. You know, it was much more important to notice if a tiger was going to jump on you, or you might be about to eat something poisonous, or someone was a threat to you and should be in your out group rather than your in group. But we understand less about why we have positive emotions, and most of the work on this has been done by a lady called Barbara Fredrickson, and she's created a theory that says although positive emotions are much more fleeting, they build up into a kind of what she calls a positivity ratio. And her ratio would tend to suggest that when we get to 3 positive experiences to 1 negative, we reach a tipping point and we start to flourish. And you can actually do her test on this, which can be quite a shock, because certainly when I did it, I was nowhere near 3 to 1. But if you think about this in terms of your culture at work, one of the things that we tend to do in business is to actually notice, for very good reasons, notice the negative. So we have things like contingency planning, we have things like regulations that are pushing us to put in place things in case something bad happens, and we get out of the habit of actually saying to people, what went well today, what were the good things that happened on this project, how might we kind of leverage and notice even more good things. So one of the factors that can help improve engagement is to help people to take more notice about what's going well rather than what's going badly. And Lindsay's put this positivity ratio up here now. Thanks, Lindsay, for that. So from an engagement point of view, we've got now 3 things that tend to link together, that we're bonded with the people we work with, that we've got a common sense of purpose, and that we notice the positives that's going on. And one of the things we know about people who are having positive experiences is that they're much more open to change, they solve more problems by insight, and they're also more creative. So you get some of those positive work benefits from that as well. And then the 4th thing is about trust. So most of the work on trust has been done by a guy called Paul Zak, and he's done work on a neurochemical called oxytocin. Now, most of us have probably heard about oxytocin because it's the chemical that's activated when mothers and babies, indeed when fathers and babies as well, bond. And the research that Zach did, he created an experiment that he called the trust game. And what he did was measure people's oxytocin levels at the beginning of playing the game, during the game, and at the end. And what he found was the higher people's oxytocin levels, the more trusting they tended to be. And interestingly, when their trust was rewarded, i.e. it was was of benefit to them, their oxytocin levels went up further. And interestingly, they also became more trustworthy. So they started to behave in a way that generated trust for other people. So what you get really is a kind of virtuous circle. So if you trust someone, they trust you, and in both cases the oxytocin levels go up, and that circle kind of continues in a positive way. The reverse is also true. If you don't trust people, the oxytocin levels start to go down. So you basically get what you sow. If you have a culture or an environment that is generating trust between people, you're more likely to get an engaged group. And if you've got an environment that isn't trusting people or is sending signals that you're doubtful about people's honesty and trustworthiness, then people's oxytocin levels start to fall and they start behaving differently. So in engagement, we've got this interplay of these 4 factors: how closely people understand each other and as in an in-group, how much they have a common sense of purpose and common goals that they pursue together, then positive mood, the culture that they're working in, and how positive that is, which again helps them achieve those goals, and finally the sense of trust that they have, which of course goes back to these are people in my in-group who are similar to me and we can do things together. Any questions about that? Because I'm going to go on to talk about a bit more about engagement scores and what might be going on in the brain there. So I can see a couple of people typing here. So can I just repeat the 4 contributors again? So the 4 contributors to engagement are a strong sense of in-group, so people being bonded together to understand who are similar to them and who have the same goals as them. Excuse me. A clear sense of purpose and common goals, and the autonomy to be able to achieve those goals with some discretionary input from the individual. Positive mood, so creating positive environment where people feel trusted and are shown trust and given trust to others. And what you then get is kind of a positive cycle of engagement, or factors that contribute to engagement. Hope that's clear. So how does all this impact on your scores? There are a couple of things I thought we'd look at that impact the way in which people are probably completing your surveys. Sorry, I'm just slightly distracted by a question from Zoe here. The issue of trust is fascinating. If your employee group is dealing with a customer base which is inherently untrustworthy, then we are working from a negative basis before we begin. Yes, you are. But I think what you can do in a situation like that is maximize the sense of in-group. So if the in-group within your organization trust each other, I think you are to some extent mitigating that external group who are probably seen as an out-group anyway. I guess the subtlety you need to deal with is, not to set up a kind of negative cycle with your customers of not trusting them and therefore they not acting in a trustworthy way, because you're sowing what you reap, so to speak. So we have another poll here. Liz, if we can put this up.
Yep.
Just talking about what people feel they are actually measuring when they're undertaking their engagement surveys. So are you measuring what people are experiencing in the moment? So are you asking people to do pulse type surveys? or are you asking them to remember what their past experience was? So you're asking people questions about the events that may have happened over the last 6 months or a year or so on. So I think the majority of people seem to be asking about past experience, which isn't surprising, because that, in a way, that's the nature of surveys, although I think we are increasingly seeing technology that enables us to do the pulse type research. And the reason I ask that is there's some really interesting work been done by Daniel Kahneman, who's the guy who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. And he's looked at two versions of ourself, one of which he calls the experiencing self, which is us having the experience, so going to a concert, having a drink with a friend, being bonded with a group at work. And the other is what he terms the remembering self. And it's actually the remembering self that does most of your survey rating, because what you're actually asking people is to remember what the experience is. And the remembering self is our memories, really, of our experiences, but they can get distorted. And when you look at his research, they particularly get distorted by things like what happened at the end of an experience will distort the way we develop the memory of the whole experience. So to give you an example, if we've done a fantastic project, we've designed a new HR process, the design team worked really well together, it's been a very positive experience for people, we've rolled out the new process to the business, and that's also gone very well. But at the debrief meeting, the CEO has 2 or 3 minor criticisms of the project. Those 2 or 3 minor criticisms coming right at the end of the project are likely to colour the whole memory of that project in a much more negative way than was probably rationally the case if you took the whole experience of the project. So we know that when negative things happen at the end of something, our whole memory of that is distorted by what might be a small negative thing. And going back to Zoe's question about the customer base who may be untrustworthy, that's people kind of looking at that client base or that customer base from the point of view of their remembering self. And the remembering self tends to tell stories about what happened. So maybe, again, because we hold a view that the customer base is untrustworthy, we are filtering what we hear and see and creating that into a memory that supports that view. So when you think about the way people may be scoring or your surveys, it's not the actual experience they had, it's how they're remembering their experience, and that's going to be coloured by things that will have happened between when the experience actually happened and when they're completing the survey, and particularly coloured by the kind of assumptions and the culture that you have. Again, going back to what we were talking about before, how positive or negative that may be. And there's some quite interesting implications here. So if you ask people to say in the moment what's important to them about work, they usually say things like the quality of their relationships and their connections with other people. If you ask them from the point of view of their remembering self what's important, so you're asking them to look back on something, they tend to say things like money. So from an HR engagement policy point of view, you're getting very different points of data, really, depending on where you're asking your questions, whether you're using a pulse-type survey of how engaged you feel right now versus a more traditional survey of how engaged have you been over the last 6 months, for example. And I think it's important, for us to realize that, because the actions we take to help people be more engaged are probably different depending on which bit of the data you're reading, and it's also different depending on what you're doing to influence. Are you taking actions to influence people's memories of how they feel, or are you taking actions to influence how people actually feel in the moment? So potentially taking actions for how people actually feel in the moment may not shift your survey results very much. That's a lot to get your head around, and I'd really recommend you have a look at the actual TED Talk on this. We've put the link up here for you, but it's a very interesting way of thinking about your surveys, I think. So we have a question here from Gideon. So basically, if people are more engaged when they work with peers that they trust, programs such as an employee bring a friend recruitment method can improve the engagement level significantly. Potentially, yes, I think that's true. Those sorts of things can, not least because what you're doing is almost encouraging people to bring their in-group into your in-group, so to speak. The other thing to think about in terms of your engagement surveys is the role of contagion. Now, there's lots of evidence that we pick up on each other's mood. And from a survival point of view, again, there's very good reasons for this. So psychologists believe that we pick up on mood both because so things like when someone is startled by something, they're frightened by something, it saves us a few seconds that we startle at the same time. We don't have to communicate, why are you jumping or flying away or running away. We just get on and do it, and from a survival point of view, that probably saved our lives. Also, we are mimics, so whatever someone else's mood is that's showing on their face and in their body language, people will mimic that behavior and those facial expressions. And we think that that's because it created more group harmony and meant that people in the group were, sharing common experiences and, again, bonding much more closely. And this is why you'll find that, people on a project team or in a training program all tend to say they have the same experience, because the mood of one is contagious to the others. So some interesting research done in 2008 and actually published in the British Medical Journal found that people have social networks and of happiness, and that they tend to cluster. So happy people tend to have a network of people who are also happy to 3 steps of removal. So their friends' friends are happy, and their friends' friends' friends are happy. And that these people tend to be in, tight clusters. So if you think about that in your own organization, and given that happiness tends to be such an important part of engagement, and indeed from our survey what most people are measuring anyway, the more you can cluster your engaged people together, the more you can begin to create a tipping point of where they, if you like, infect other people to be engaged. Obviously, the reverse is also true. So what you want to try and avoid is a very small group of engaged people who are, so to speak, contaminated by the disaffected. So pull your engaged people together and make the most of them, because for every one engaged person, this research would seem to suggest there's a 9% chance that they will positively infect somebody else, which is a lovely way, I think, of thinking about creating a positive virus. So going back to some questions here, we got something from Matt. Would the remembering self distort over time? The good old days mentality means that when change is implemented, yeah, that's exactly what's happening, Matt. So we look back on our past memories and amplify them, basically. And we're remembering not what actually happened, but our interpretation of it. We also know that memories are not stable, and that every time we remember something, subtle changes are made in it. It's not like a film replaying that is stable. It gets changed just by the reuse of it. So I think, if we're motivated to think about the past is more positive, then the good old days get better and better. And anyone who's got, fairly elderly parents will, or even getting old themselves, will know that we see that happening ourselves. So I don't know what people think about this idea of contagion and how much you've seen that happen in your own organizations. The research is very, very strong as well, that the leader will, send positive or negative mood to the team, and that's one of the things the team will pick up on very, very strongly. So we've got about 3 or 4 minutes to go. That's all I had to say. Happy to deal with your questions as in the next 2 or 3 minutes. But I just also wanted to talk about our next breakfast club, if I may, because we're doing something slightly different. We've had, over the years, a number of organizations and clients talk to us about how can we help leaders be more brain savvy. So how can we help them actually work in a way that has that's based on an understanding of how the brain works, and in doing that more effectively lead themselves and lead others. And we've developed a self-assessment that looks at just those things. And what we're doing for the next webinar is giving you an opportunity to complete that self-assessment for free while we collect our norm data. And then the webinar on the 7th of July will take you through the science behind that self-assessment. So when you do the self-assessment, you'll get your own report of your own results, but then join the webinar and we'll give you the background on the science. So if you sign up for that, we'll send you the link to do the self-assessment, and feel free to pass that on to your colleagues who might be interested in doing it, both in HR and in the business more generally, because we're actually using this with leaders both within HR and outside of HR. So just a couple of quick questions in the last minute. We've got one from Jess. I've seen the disaffection from infected people in the organisation. I no longer work there. Very good to get out of those negative environments, Jess. And then another one here. While engaged employees cluster together, so do the unengaged people. That's absolutely true. And you get those clusters of very negative people that can infect each other. And Jess here has also done a link to an article on this. Thank you very much for that, Jess. And David is saying that's the massive power of the negative fighting the positive. Any way you can amplify the positive will help combat this. Yeah, and the things that Barbara Fredrickson tells us that can amplify the positive is to do things that go out of your way to try and notice the positive. So things like journaling, things like doing positive reviews on how projects are done, things like even doing a kind of audit of your day at the end of the day and just noting down the positives that have happened. Because they're very fleeting, we often don't savor the positive moments. So, just encouraging people to notice more of that and to build that into a ritual in the way teams work can have a massive effect very quickly. And then finally, I think most people know we've written a couple of books, Brain Savvy HR and Brain Savvy Leading. If you'd like more details of those, they're on our website or on Amazon. So thank you, everyone. I hope you found that useful. And Liz, thank you very much for hosting this for us. For people who are engaged in recruitment, Liz runs a recruitment outsourcing business, and you might want to talk to her about your recruitment needs.
Thanks, Jan. Thank you very, very much for that. I'm absolutely, totally engaged in everything that you're saying as well. I'm sure everybody else is absolutely fascinating. Thank you. And thank you to everybody for all the comments, the questions, and answering the polls and everything else as well. It's a really, really good webinar. I'm sure everyone will agree. Some really good thoughts coming through there as well on the chat. So thank you, everybody. It'll wrap up really, really quickly. I just wanted to let you know there are contact us if you want to get in touch with us with regards to any kind of recruitment campaigns or changes that you might be making to your structure at the moment. Please get in touch. And finally, John's mentioned the webinar for next month already, and there's a link as well where you can go and book directly. So thank you very much. Very, very good. And I will send you through the recordings with some of these links, or the links that we've talked about today. So thank you.
Okay, thanks,
Lisa,
Liz.
to finish off, thank you.
Yeah, and everyone, get your memory as your remembering self.
Definitely going to go and have a look at that one.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Jan, I'm going to end the meeting now, and Sarah and Lindsay will dial in on the other platform. Okay? Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.